So waiting in the wings is our final speaker, my buddy who left the UK to go and live in Canada. So he's got up very early this morning to join us. So Mahlon Evans-Sinclair is going to share some of the learning he's been privy to through his podcast, which he'll tell you more about. So Mahlon, over to you.
Cheers, Hannah. Nice to see everyone. Nice to meet everyone. Yeah, definitely been up since early 4 a.m. this time listening in, and it's been really, really fantastic. So thank you to everyone that I had a chance to listen into before now. So already introduced, but I'll give a bit more of a flavor. So my name is Mahlon Evans-Sinclair, pronouns are he, him. I currently am in Toronto, Canada, after having spent a number of years in the UK in many different roles in education. And the current role that I have is a school Director of Equity, Diversity and Inclusion in a girl-focused independent school in the middle of Toronto. I say girl-focused because though it is codified as a monogendered school, not everyone identifies with the gender of the school as it is. And as part of my role, is one of the things that I'm trying to really push for is to make sure that the words that we use mean the things that we want them to say. So girl-focused is the word that I've landed on, and trying to make sure that that is really, really clear there. I also speak about this work, and one of the main places and platforms that I have is a podcast called Educating While Black. So this particular talk I want to try and wrap up in 10 minutes is just to try and give a bit of a snapshot as to what does it mean to control the narrative and to have visibility as Black people, Black teachers, Black educators within what is now seen as a bit of a virtual Black staff room. So to give a bit of a background to it, so I am a Teach First alum. I did it in 2009. And when I was going through the training, they had a particular event at the time. Don't think it exists anymore, but it's called a Cockup Club. And the premise of the Cockup Club were these two things here. So they were events focused on individual challenges that leaders have had to overcome, that have informed their development as a successful leader. And they were also meetings with successful leaders speaking about their own career low points and how failure and despair could be turned around. Sounded amazing, really cool. Had opportunities to speak to a number of people who came from various different backgrounds in education, not just in education, sorry, in leadership and employment and services. But here's the thing, no one on that panel ever looks like me. No one ever spoke to a scenario or a situation where I could feel that I could make the same quote unquote cock up as they did and they talked about, and rock up to work the following day and still have a job in the same position that I had the day before. I still remember vividly, for example, in 2008, when we had the credit crunch, the whole, global financial situation that we're still living through. One of the main people that I do remember being wheeled out as one of the culprits of causing this all was a Black guy. Not too much information was given about him. He was not from the UK. He was an African national who was now living in the UK as a permanent resident, leave to remain. And he was one of the people that was kind of wheeled out as being the face of what was to be the sort of rollout of the credit crunch. And it just really, that to me kind of struck a chord with me, which is around, what does it mean to have the penalty of being Black and doing the same things that other people do and other people crop afoul for, but not really having the space for vulnerability, not really having the space for apologies, and having this one singular voice be seen as one of the early culprits of the credit crunch really, really stood out to me. In doing some more research more recently, though, and this came out in 2020, and I remember Ria was speaking about this, other people have spoken about this beforehand as well, that 2020 kind of was a bit of a watershed moment for some, but not for all. As said, 2009 was my sort of entry point into this. There was a lot of work done about race relations in the workplace. And one of the places that I found it really interesting to look at was around HR. And so if you think about what organizations do, they clone a culture, they decide what the culture is, they clone it, they codify it, they put policies in place to kind of demonstrate that this is the culture that we want to be in our workplace. And if you think about what that looks like on a sociological global level, particularly in the sort of Northern Hemisphere areas of things, the most influential groups by race and gender are societally white and cis male. And the reasons for this is that they exist closer to the proximity and access of power in society. And so when we think about what that looks like in education, that also rings true, but for the fact that education is also a gendered career choice to be in. And so white women have a elevated space or status within education. But one of the things that often happens with being able to see implicit biases that even exist in oneself, is that you don't always see it. So the main culprit is typically the cisgendered white male. And a lot of times white women do not see themselves as perhaps complicit in some of the same behaviors that white men do outside of education. So what that looks like is that organizational policy is often written to protect and clone the dominant culture, both within and outside more widely. So in speaking about this work that I was looking at, sorry about the sort of the presentation bottom at the the presentation at the bottom of the slide. What it kind of demonstrates is that policies are typically written about universal, impartial, and neutral objectives, and they are often written in a way that don't have anything to do with context or appreciation of power or specifics. And so people who write these sort of policies don't take into account and appreciation the impact that they have in writing them and the impact that they have in pushing them out. And one of the main things here to talk about is the idea that race claims are often one of the most commonly filed complaints to HR, but they have the lowest rate of success, like 15%. And in the same way, financial payouts are often the easiest way of giving compensation, not reform, not changing things within the system, not having that person stay within the system. There still is an element of push out, and it still results in we can just pay it away. So much so that some budgets actually have a sort of stipend for this particular reason, that we can pay out the situations that we have rather than actually fix them on the inside. Policing is one of those moments. In the same way, one of the things that I found quite interesting with this particular piece of research, 49% to 13% of Black to white HR professional thinks that race or ethnicity-based discrimination exists in their job. So what that's saying is that half of Black people who work in HR, and again, school has HR is in school, half of the people who identify as Black would say that race comes up, but only 13% of people who are white say that it comes up. Again, 61% of Black people say that rude comments and incivility exist in the workplace. 44% of white HR professionals think the same. The thing that's quite interesting about that is that there are often times where, if you think about the penalties that Black people typically have in terms of how they present themselves, how they speak, that one, I can see why it's quite high for white folks as well, because rude comments and incivility, if you could just say that a bit more professionally, if your attitude was a bit more to my liking, if you could basically assimilate more, we wouldn't have the issue that we have. So I'm not surprised that that 44% is as high as it is. So thinking then back about the podcast and why I wanted to speak to these sorts of issues in the podcast is that what is the value of having a Black staff room where I'm not saying I'm HR, but I've had such a range of experience in education that I'm in a particular position to speak to a number of situations that myself and other Black folk have come up against in trying to navigate their careers in education. So what does it look like to have a Black staff room to be seen and valued and heard? So some of the key learning points so far, I've had 2 seasons. The first season was directly focused on men in education, women in education. The second season is now looking at men in education. And these are some of the main points that I have started to come up with based on some of the key learnings. And so the names here correspond to different episodes, so please feel free to go and listen to them. And I recognize that some people have joined us today as well who are listed here. So again, thank you for your contribution at that stage. But the main 4 things that kind of came to pass was the reason for going into the classroom, initial underestimation and lack of advancement when in the profession. So when we think about recruitment, retention, advancement, progression, those sorts of things. And a lot of speakers have already spoken about the statistical data and information about that. The double weighted trauma of being Black, seeing policies that are anti-Black, having to push those policies out on Black students while still being Black, and then having to almost have the cognitive dissonance of like, I know that for example, the hair policy is racist. I know that I have to enforce the racist hair policy in school. And at the same time, everyone that looks like me has hair that would be penalized in the system for where you go to. So there's a double weighted trauma for being Black and having to push these things out. And then finally, again, as mentioned about culture and policy. Just some quick headlines here. Nearly all teachers that I asked them the question about why did you go into education, they always pretty much without fail talked about the idea of overcoming adversity that they either experienced or that they witnessed. And the love of the subject or school education were not initial responses, which is converse to a lot of my white friends. And I've been a teacher trainer beforehand. So when I've asked new teachers into the profession that question, it's often, I love the subject or I really like that phase in school. That's why I went into it. Similarly, a number of teachers, and this has come up earlier on as well, they feel that they need to take on extra roles to compensate for the idea that they are still too junior to get the promotion. And when we think about aspiring heads, they talked about that earlier on as well. Some felt the need to change school completely. I personally left the UK due to feeling that I hit a bit of a glass ceiling, and I knew I was very good. Like, my credentials would demonstrate that I was very good. And at the same time, I was now too black to be good enough to continue going in this sort of trajectory that I was in. So what's the benefit of this particular space? Well, this is a teacher who is a former teacher, sorry, who is pretty prolific in the UK, Aisha Small. And one of the things that she said about the podcast, which is really nice to hear, is that it's almost like being a witness to the secret lives of Black teachers. And it's what Black teachers say when they feel safe, and that's what the value is, especially when non-Black educators wouldn't hear these conversations normally. I'm just going to quickly end on this part. I know that my time is really short, but I just want to talk about allyship and coalition, because Ria really brought that to the conversation. And I am going to front the fact that I was watching the chat in the YouTube channel and just noticed how fewer questions and comments came up with that particular presentation than came up with other presentations. And part of what that speaks to is the idea of exactly what she said, which is, what does it mean to stop saying stuff and do stuff? And where we currently are in the system is that we have a lot of ERGs, we have a lot of affinity groups, we have DEI roles, I'm in one, and we have a lot of listening and learning. But what I want people to be understanding of, and sorry that this slide is presented in this particular way, is that there are things that can be done that are supportive of Black people in education. Pattern spotting is a huge one. This image probably was shared a lot in 2020, the idea of that there are 4 dimensions of oppression / racism: that which is within, that which is between, that which is organizational, and that which is structural. All of us default somewhere. There are those of us who will say that bad people do racist things, and so therefore, if you're not a bad person, you don't do racist things, and so therefore we don't have to worry about the racism that exists regardless of whether people act with bad intent or not. And so do you default to the idea that if a person didn't mean it, their words shouldn't hurt? Are you a person who believes that the policies, and we talked about this before, a number of presenters spoke about the idea that things that are written down on paper don't actually have any teeth unless the people behind them are able to push them. So though we have a bit of a murky world of policy, it's true, it does help us as EDI practitioners, but it doesn't help us as Black people when people are also able to shift the goalpost as to what was meant with regards to EDI and inclusion practices. And so then that main question is, well, how well equipped are you to deal with the multi-layered aspects of racial and gender oppression? If you feel like you are not able to deal with it on multiple different levels, that is something for you to work on. The idea that actually you yourself can hold anti-Black views and be Black, just as you can hold anti-women views and be a woman. J.K. Rowling, enough said. So in that situation, we have an understanding of where do we need to go with our understanding of what needs to happen next. And then similarly here, with the idea of we recognize that public punishment and public praise do different things for students. The same thing is true here. How do we interrupt and how do we offer strategic affirmations? Are you aware of what the inequity is that's going on in that moment? How do you know how to discern individually to a group in the moment and post-event in a public-private setting? All of those things have different impacts to the person that you're trying to support in that moment. And I recognize that that was a hasty run to the end, but what I would say is that EWB, my ability to try and pull all of those different parts together means that for Black teachers who come onto the conversation, they feel safe and supported. And for those who do not identify as Black, it is a really good resource for you to understand what actually goes on in the life of a Black educator as they are going through the education system. Thank you for your time.
Brilliant, Mahlon, thank you. And I let you have a bit of extra time, like you did get up at 4 a.m, showing true commitment to the cause here. I gave you a later slot thinking you could have a decent line, but actually, if you want to listen to it all, I apologise for that and say thank you.
No, all good.
So I just want to come back to something you said, because this comes up quite a lot in conversations I have about those single sex or monogender schools. And I've been to a few girls' schools where everything is pink. And that kind of thinking about gender identity when you are having to choose which school to go to, and how inclusive those single sex or monogender schools can be or could be for non-binary identities. Could you just say a little bit more about your thinking around that?
Yeah, so I'm doing a lot of work this year on the term, at least out here under the Human Rights Act within Ontario, is called SOGI. So sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression is the sort of whole acronym. And one of the things that I'm really minded to pay attention to in the school that I'm working in is that you can't separate the intersectionality of, for example, WASPy cultural norms, so white Anglo-Saxon Protestant norms, would also suggest that there is a way that you can be that a way that homophobia, for example, even exists as it's expressed by those who are deemed to be more masculine and those who are deemed to be more feminine. And so, for example, in a girl-focused school, where we often look to is the sort of external explosions of these kind of things. So we look for the fights, we look for the sort of hair pulling, we look for the sort of things that the TV tells us that this is how it comes out. We expect that boys act in this particular way, but actually when you're in a girl-focused school, those are not the sort of places that you look for. You have to gender that which is racial expectations and cultural expectations. So where would you expect girls or those who identify as female, how do they typically navigate spaces of bullying? How do they navigate spaces of, we know that we can't say certain things or act in certain ways, but we're going to do it differently. So it might be more online, it might be in note passing, it might be different things. And it's just really interesting how a school can be of one demographic, if you like, and not necessarily see what its own obligation is to learn about what its place is in the spectrum of how different things can come up. So it's fascinating being a male, a cis male on senior leadership and having these conversations to reflect it back to basically all white women. And having that conversation of like, these are still beyond your peripheral vision. I don't like using the word blind spot, but these are just before beyond your peripheral vision. What does that mean for what you may have been missing until now? And if you ask, and a number of people have spoken about this before, if you ask alumni data, they will tell you what school was like. So why are we not asking those questions when they are in school and dealing with it when they're in school?
Yeah, such key points there, and that perception gap that we're not always aware of, and like you mentioned about the implicit biases in the HR systems and in the recruitment systems, and the perception gaps of what is predominantly a cis white female group of HR professionals. And I'm doing a few talks to HR spaces where, like, what training are the HR people management people having to actually guide the policies and guide the processes? I think there is a gap there that really needs addressing.
One of the major things, just to jump on that, one of the major things that comes up is there's a term, is failure of performance feedback, and I've been victim of that too, where basically I've executed the task, I've done everything that I've needed to do, but people would be more on side if you were able to speak to them differently. Or people would buy more into your vision if you were able to be a bit more congenial with them. Okay, cool, but was the task done, and was it done on time, and was it done to a high quality? Can we tick those things off? Everything else now is your perception of how I go about doing that task, which isn't how you would do that task, because we don't share the same identity. So oftentimes what people are met with is the feedback of, could you just package yourself in a way that pleases me more? We would have fewer problems, save for all of the ways that you actually meet expectations and exceed them. That is negated by the fact that your presentation of doing it wasn't pleasing to me.
It's such a key point, that subjectivity, and even thinking about how we frame job opportunities and what's desirable, what's essential, and the barriers we put in place there. There's two phrases that have come up in the chat, and I want you to unpack them, because I don't think we've talked about microaggressions enough today.
No.
Dream, that's surely something that's come up a lot in your interviews for the podcast. You want to just do a bit of a brain dump to the audience about microaggressions and how we can be complicit and how we need to challenge them.
Absolutely. So microaggressions, as a sort of phrasing, they're sort of micro signals to a person that you are either for them or against them. That's just the simplest way of putting it. They often come up without our knowing, so we're not always consciously aware of our microaggressions, but they might be certain things that, for example, a Black person walks into a room, the room goes quiet. It might be a situation of you ask questions as to why are all the Black people sitting together in the staff room, in the classroom. It might be that school that suggests that saying certain words have certain racial connotations and seeing nothing wrong with it. But the main thing is that, the phrase that we're always brought up with, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Lie. Words do hurt, and they hurt on multiple different levels. They hurt in the moment, they can hurt historically, they can hurt multi-generationally, they have a huge impact. And so, as spoken about before, that whole idea of them being unconscious is a bit of a misnomer. It's more the fact that they are implicit. We are all raised in the same society. We all ingest the same media, save for subcultures or different cultures or pluralistic cultures. So we all ingest the same understandings. And so to suggest that there is a way that the attention and intention that I have to you is overridden by, overrides the impact that it has on you, doesn't actually wash. And so if we're thinking about how power also plays a role in that, as educators, we hold the power. So we can really mess up students' life chances in the moment and after by our own implicit biases that we have of them, by giving them opportunities or not, giving them further sanctions or not. And so thinking about that power piece is also hugely important, because students can't leverage back to us that which we can wield upon them, in the same way that racialized minorities or racialized as non-white people cannot leverage the same power against those who are racialized as whites as those who are racialized as white can leverage on everybody else.
Yeah, thank you for that. And the final question is about a term we don't hear as often. We talk about the glass ceiling quite a lot, and I think being a female-heavy profession, we're quite painfully acutely aware of it. But the concrete ceiling term isn't as sort of like used as with such familiarity or confidence. And you talked about hitting the concrete ceiling yourself in the UK system and going abroad. But I also know from your work on recruitment and ITTE, there are those concrete ceilings. Can that just be your final thought, your final comment?
Sure. So here's the thing: the glass ceiling presumes that you can see what's going on, but you don't have access to it. So you can almost lip read what's going on in the room. You can see what's going on in the room. You just don't have access to it. A concrete ceiling is when you don't even have access to seeing what's going on behind the curtain, as it were. And though I mentioned it about in my own specific situation in the UK, I guess I got to a place where I was pretty high up in a big multi-academy trust, working in the central office, and there were still rooms that I was not allowed to go into, or conversations that I was not allowed to be privy to, though I was tasked with doing all of the work. So what that means is that though I have an implicit or sort of an assumed understanding of how things are working behind the scenes, I do not have the actual vision of what that could look like. The group who typically faces the concrete ceiling the most, though, are racialized as non-white women. So there is an element of, if we're going to give someone the opportunity to redress the equality balance, we're going to give the role to a white woman. We don't think about women who are not racialized as white. And so what that means is that those women do not have any clue, or it's harder for them to have a clue as to how the behind the scenes workings of progression, recruitment, retention, those kind of things work. And so the concrete ceiling really just speaks to the fact that I can't see it as much as I don't have access to it.
Yeah, and it's such a key point. It's something that I see quite regularly, that spaces are being diversified by inviting women in, but they are always women of a certain demographic. And I'm acutely aware, being a heterosexual, white, cisgender woman, that I'm in that dominant group. And when you spoke to that, I kind of shrunk a little bit. But we have, that's the acknowledgement, but we also then need to think about how we leverage that power. Absolutely. And just accepting that seat on that panel or that seat in that space to represent your sex isn't enough. We need to be asking those questions about who else isn't invited into that space as well.
Totally that. Just on that real quick, there's a joke that goes around about how Scarlett Johansson will take any role, right? And so on one hand, there is leverage, there's rights to leverage on Scarlett Johansson, the fact that, yes, you do seem to pop up in every single role that doesn't necessarily take your identity, but also who are the people that are constantly casting her in roles for these things, and why is her name the only name that I use? And so, I really can't tell actors and actresses apart. I believe that they're the same 4 people doing all the roles everywhere, because you want me to believe that this shape, this size, this hair color, this eye color, these are the people who matter. So if I interchange them and I don't really know who they are, you can't blame me for that, because you're basically saying to me that this is the sort of archetype of everything. And I just wonder what it'd be like if those people said, do you know what, not me for this role, but here's someone else that could do it. What does it mean to use your identity to leverage others who are not in the room?
That's a great final takeaway comment there, Mahlon. Thank you so much for joining us. Go and get some sleep. Go and enjoy your weekend. I'll speak to you soon. Thank you so much.